she whispered. "I'm not worth saving," her voice carrying the weight of every wound that told her she didn't matter. But the cowboy only drew closer and said, "Then let me prove you wrong." And it makes you wonder, can love truly heal the scars a heart no longer believes in? The prairie was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. A lone woman sat on the porch of a weathered cabin at the edge of Red Hollow, her hands folded in her lap, as if holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. Her name was Clementine Dyer, though most folks had forgotten it just as they'd forgotten her. Her dress, once sky blue, had faded under sun and sorrow. Strands of dark hair, loosened from a braid, clung to her face as the wind whispered across the land. She stared out into nothing, her thoughts circling back to the same merciless refrain she'd carried for years. "I'm not worth saving." It wasn't just words to Clementine, it was the creed life had carved into her. Every abandonment, every whisper behind her back, every door shut in her face had stacked atop the last, until her spirit bent beneath the weight. She had been a daughter no family wanted, a wife discarded when her husband vanished into the lawless territories, and now she was simply a shadow with no place to belong. That morning, she whispered it aloud, her voice hoarse from disuse. "No man wants a woman like me. No man should." The words carried across the yard, where a chestnut horse had just come to a halt. Its rider, a broad-shouldered cowboy in a dust-worn hat, reined in at the sound. He hadn't planned on stopping, only passing through to water his horse on the way to Silver Butte, but something in that voice rooted him to the spot. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on gravel, and leaned an arm across the saddle horn. The name folks knew him by was Silas Boone, a man who had ridden through more sorrow than he cared to admit. He had the kind of presence that didn't need words, calm, steady, like the earth itself. "You talkin' to the wind or to me?" His tone was even unthreatening, but it cut through her haze like a blade through cloth. Clementine startled, her hands tightening. She hadn't noticed him ride up, and shame burned her cheeks at being overheard. "Don't matter who I was talking to, ain't nobody listening anyway." Silas tilted his hat back, studying her with eyes that had seen too much, but still carried a spark of kindness. "Well, I heard enough to know you're wrong about that." Her heart gave a small, painful thud. Men usually passed her by without so much as a glance. Why was this stranger standing there, listening, answering words that weren't meant to be answered? Silas didn't press closer. He just stood, quiet, giving her space as though he knew that crowding her would make her retreat. The silence stretched, not heavy this time, but waiting. Clementine looked away, her voice brittle. "You'd best keep riding, cowboy. You don't want nothing to do with me." His reply was soft, but it carried a weight she hadn't felt in years. "Maybe that's exactly why I stopped." For the first time in forever, Clementine felt the faintest ripple of curiosity stir beneath her despair. If this beginning already pulls at your heart, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever felt like Clementine, convinced you weren't worth saving? Clementine hadn't meant for anyone to hear her broken confession, least of all some stranger with calm eyes and the patience to answer her. She rose to her feet slowly, as if bracing for another blow life might deal her, and folded her arms around herself. "Don't waste your words on me," she muttered. "I ain't nobody's concern." Silas Boone let the reins fall loose, his horse cropping at the sparse grass near the fence. He stayed where he was, boots planted, as if rooted deeper than any oak. "You're wrong about that," he said evenly. "Ain't met you till now, but I can see plain as day. You're somebody's concern, maybe even mine." Her laugh was sharp and hollow, more a reflex than a sound of joy. "Yours? Don't go fooling yourself. Men don't stay, mister. They leave. Always do." Something flickered in Silas's gaze, not pity, not surprise, but recognition. He had worn that truth once himself, carrying the memory of a family grave he dug with his own hands, a woman he hadn't been able to save. He shifted his weight slightly, but his voice stayed steady. Some men leave, sure, but not all. You look at the whole world through the hurt someone else left behind. That's no way to measure every man who rides by. Clementine bristled at the thought of being read so easily. She wanted to send him off with a wave of her hand, drive him away before he could look too close. Yet something about his tone, quiet, matter of fact, with no trace of judgment, kept her rooted. "Why are you even talking to me?" she asked at last, her voice raw. Silas gave the faintest shrug. "Because I heard someone say they weren't worth saving, and I reckon that's a lie. I ain't willing to ride past." The words hit her harder than she cared to admit. She pressed a hand to the railing of the porch to steady herself. No one had ever challenged the verdict she'd given herself, the one she repeated day after day, until it felt carved into her bones. Not worth saving. Her instinct was to argue, to drive his words away with sharpness, but her throat tightened. The longer she stood there, the more the quiet between them shifted. It wasn't silence of abandonment, it was silence that listened. Finally, she found her voice again. "You don't even know me, Cowboy. You don't know the things I've done, the ways I've failed." Silas nodded slowly, his jaw tightening with memory. "Maybe not, but I know what it feels like to believe the worst about yourself, and I know how heavy it gets, carrying that belief day after day." He paused, his eyes steady on hers. "Doesn't mean it's the truth." Clementine's breath caught. Nobody had ever said that to her, not her kin, not her husband, not the townsfolk who crossed the street to avoid her. She turned her face away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. "You'll be gone by morning." "They all are." Silas adjusted his hat against the fading sun, his answer measured but sure. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." His words lingered in the evening air, unsettling and steady all at once. For the first time in years, Clementine wasn't sure what tomorrow might bring, and that uncertainty frightened her more than despair ever had. The sun slid lower, washing the horizon in streaks of orange and gold. Silas Boone leaned a shoulder against the fence rail, one hand brushing the neck of his horse. He didn't try to bridge the space between himself and Clementine, not yet. He knew better than to rush a creature already wounded by too many careless hands. Clementine stood rigid on the porch, arms still crossed tight as armor. She told herself she didn't care if he stayed or left. Yet she couldn't look away from him, from the quiet way he carried himself, as though the world had stripped him bare once and he decided never to flinch again. "You act like you know something about me," she said at last, her voice sharp but trembling underneath. "But you don't. You can't." Silas's jaw worked as though weighing how much truth to share. "You're right. I don't know your story. But I know what it's like to live with ghosts." That drew her eyes. "Ghosts?" He nodded once, gaze drifting past her toward the distant line of hills. "I buried a wife out there, 5 winters ago. Fever took her quick, and no doctor within 100 miles could help. I sat at her side, till the last breath, tellin' myself I'd failed her. Spent months convinced I wasn't worth drawin' another." The words were spoken plain, without theatrics, but they landed heavily. Clementine gripped the porch railing until her knuckles whitened. She hadn't expected him to bear anything of himself, let alone something that echoed her own broken belief. "You kept riding," she whispered, almost to herself. "I did," he said softly. "But it wasn't for me. Was for the horses that still needed feedin', for the neighbors who leaned on a pair of hands when storms rolled in. Took a long while before I realized, livin' ain't about earnin' your worth in some ledger. Sometimes, it's just about standin' where you're needed." Clementine let the words settle. They felt foreign, dangerous even, because a part of her wanted to believe them. And wanting was scarier than despair, it risked hope. "You talk easy about stayin'," she said, bitterness creeping back. "But when you see the truth of me, you'll walk like the rest. Folks always do." Silas's gaze snapped back to her, steady as stone. "Don't mistake silence for leavin', Clementine. I've carried enough sorrow of my own to recognize it in someone else. And I don't scare easily." Her lips parted, then closed again. For the briefest flicker, she felt the ground beneath her tilt, because here was a man who didn't flinch at brokenness, who didn't look away. Still, fear coiled tight around her heart. She turned her face aside, whispering like a confession meant only for the twilight. "Then maybe you're the foolest man I ever met." Silas allowed a small, rueful smile. "Maybe. Or maybe I just know that sometimes the fool's the only one stubborn enough to stand when everyone else runs." The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of dry sage and the promise of night. Clementine felt something shift in the silence, something she hadn't felt in years. The beginning of a question she was almost afraid to ask. What if he doesn't leave? Morning light spilled over the plains, gilding the rough boards of Clementine's porch. She hadn't slept much, tossing on her narrow bed with the echo of Silas Boone's words tangled in her mind. By the time the rooster crowed, she told herself it hadn't mattered, he'd be gone come sunrise. Yet when she stepped outside with her worn shawl around her shoulders, there he was. Silas stood by the corral, sleeves rolled up, hefting buckets of water toward her trough. His chestnut gelding stamped nearby, already unsaddled and grazing as though its rider had no intention of moving on. Clementine froze. "What are you doing?" Silas didn't pause in his work. "Your stock tank was bone dry. Figured the few hens you got left might appreciate water for the sun climbs higher." Her lips pressed tight. Nobody had lifted a hand for her in years, not without something expected in return. Suspicion flared first, familiar and sharp. "Don't need your charity." He set the bucket down gently, straightening to face her. "Didn't say you did. Just seemed the right thing to do." The simplicity of it unsettled her more than grand gestures would have. He hadn't asked, hadn't announced himself, just noticed a need and filled it. She hugged her shawl tighter, as if bracing against a kindness she didn't trust. By midday, she found him, in the small garden patch behind the cabin, kneeling in the dirt. He'd repaired a section of fence that had sagged, propping it upright with scavenged posts. His hands were caked with earth, but his movements were deliberate, patient. "You keep fixin' everything, Cowboy," she muttered from the porch. "You'll have no excuse to leave." Silas glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Maybe that's the point. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scoff, to tell him not to waste effort on a woman like her. Instead, she turned away sharply, retreating indoors where the air smelled of dust and loneliness. But when the evening cooled, Clementine found herself stepping back outside. She caught sight of Silas brushing down his horse with steady strokes, murmuring to the animal as if the world weren't watching. Something about the way he cared for the creature, the gentleness in those rough hands, made her throat ache. "Why?" she asked suddenly. The words slipped out harsher than intended. "Why are you still here?" Silas paused, resting the brush against the horse's flank. His eyes met hers across the yard, calm and unwavering. "Because yesterday I heard someone say they weren't worth saving, and until they believe otherwise, I aim to prove 'em wrong." The words lodged deep, shaking something loose she thought was long dead. She turned quickly, afraid he might see the shimmer in her eyes. For years, Clementine had lived expecting abandonment as surely as night follows day. Yet here was a man who didn't just speak of staying, he showed it, plank by plank, bucket by bucket. And for the first time, the fortress around her heart quivered, not from breaking, but from something trying to grow again. Days slipped by, measured not by loneliness as before, but by the sound of another pair of boots on the ground beside hers. Silas Boone hadn't ridden on. He was simply there feeding her hens, before she even stirred from bed, splitting wood by the shed, mending what her weary hands hadn't touched in months. Clementine hated how easily her eyes found him. She told herself it was suspicion, a need to keep watch. Yet some part of her clung to the sight of him like a lifeline. One evening she sat on the porch, sewing a tear in her skirt with stiff fingers. Silas was nearby, sharpening a hatchet. The steady scrape of stone on steel filled the silence. Finally, she muttered, "Don't know why you keep on. I ain't giving you thanks." He didn't look up. Didn't come for thanks. The needle pricked her thumb, and she hissed softly, sucking the sting away. "Then what? You think I'll suddenly turn sweet because a man swings an axe at me?" Silas set the blade aside and leaned forward on his knees. His gaze was steady but not unkind. "No, ma'am, I don't expect sweetness. I just reckon everybody deserves to know they ain't alone." Her throat tightened, and she stabbed the needle through the cloth harder than necessary. "You talk like you know what being alone feels like." "I do." His voice was low, rough-edged with memory. "Too well." She looked up despite herself. In his eyes she caught a shadow that mirrored her own, the kind of hurt that didn't fade, only settled deeper. It unsettled her more than pity would have, because it meant he wasn't speaking from a pedestal, but from the same valley she lived in. Clementine tried to cover the tremor in her voice with scorn. "Careful, cowboy. You keep talking that way. I might almost believe you mean it." Silas tilted his head slightly, as though weighing his words. "Believe it or not, Clementine, I don't throw words around just to fill silence. If I say something, it's because I intend to stand by it." The porch creaked under her as she shifted uneasily. That was what frightened her most. Not his presence, but the weight behind it. Every man before had made promises that shattered like glass. She had built her life on expecting disappointment. It was easier than daring to hope. Later that night, when she lay awake staring at the rafters, his voice echoed in her chest. "Everybody deserves to know they ain't alone." She pressed her fist to her eyes, furious at the warmth rising where cold emptiness had always Saturday. The cracks in her armor were showing, and she hated it, because once you let someone through, they held the power to leave you broken all over again. And yet, for the first time in years, Clementine wondered what it would feel like if someone chose not to leave. The storm rolled in suddenly and fierce, the sky blackening as if the heavens themselves shared Clementine's unrest. Wind rattled the shutters, and rain slashed sideways across the plains. In the small cabin, the walls groaned, the lamp flickering as thunder cracked close enough to shake the floorboards. Clementine stood by the window, arms wrapped tight around herself. Her breath came quick, uneven, her chest squeezed by more than the storm outside. The closeness of Silas Boone, his presence in her yard, his steady gaze, the words he spoke had stirred things she thought she'd buried for good, and the fear of it all pressed harder than the thunder. When the door creaked open, she spun, her eyes flashing. Silas stepped in from the rain, water streaming off his hat brim, his shoulders broad and dripping. He shut the door carefully behind him, as though mindful not to jar her more than she already was. "Wind snapped a branch across your fence line," he said calmly, setting his wet hat aside. "I'll see to it once the rain lets up." Clementine's hands clenched. "Why? Why do you keep doing this?" Her voice was ragged, louder than she meant. "You fix things that ain't yours. Carry burdens that don't belong to you. I never asked you to stay." Silas didn't flinch. He peeled off his soaked coat, draping it over a chair, his movements slow, deliberate. "You didn't have to ask." Her breath shuddered. She hated how steady he was, how his calm only made the storm inside her roar louder. "You'll regret it. You'll see what I am and you'll walk. Everyone does. I ain't worth your trouble, Silas Boone." The thunder outside cracked as if to echo her fury. She braced herself for him to argue, or worse, to turn and leave. But Silas only stepped closer, his boots thudding firm against the wood. He didn't crowd her, didn't reach for her, just stopped within reach of her trembling voice. "I've buried regret, Clementine," he said, voice low and steady as the rain. "I've carried it heavier than any saddlebag. You ain't that. You're just someone who forgot what it feels like to be stood by." Her throat burned. Tears she hadn't shed in years pressed behind her eyes, hot and unbidden. She wanted to scream at him, shove him back out into the storm, anything to keep him from seeing how close she was to breaking. Instead, her voice cracked into a whisper. "And if I fall apart right here? Then I'll be here when the pieces settle." The lightning flared, illuminating his face weathered. Sure, not pleading but certain. That certainty cracked something in her stronger than any thunderclap. The tears broke free, streaking her cheeks as she covered her face with her hands. For the first time since she could remember, Clementine wept in front of someone. And Silas Boone, true to his word, didn't move to fix her, didn't recoil. He just stayed quiet as bedrock while the storm raged on. Outside, the rain hammered harder. Inside, something else began to shift. A woman's belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as forsaken as she thought. By morning, the storm had spent itself. The prairie stretched wide and glistening, washed clean under a sky of pale gold. Clementine stepped outside, her eyes swollen from tears she hadn't meant to shed. The air smelled of wet earth, the kind of scent that whispered of renewal, but she wasn't ready to believe in such things. Silas Boone was already at work. She spotted him by the fence line, hauling the fallen branch he'd mentioned the night before. His movements were efficient, unhurried, as though storms and broken things were nothing new to him. She lingered in the doorway, unsure whether to speak. A part of her wanted to retreat inside, rebuild the walls she'd let crumble in front of him. But when Silas glanced up and caught her watching, he tipped his hat with the faintest smile before turning back to his task. No questions, no pity, just presence. That morning set the tone for days that followed. Silas didn't press her with words, didn't demand confessions or gratitude. Instead, he shared small acts of life. Together they fed the hens, split kindling, and cleared the debris left by the storm. Ordinary tasks, but to Clementine they felt extraordinary, because someone else's shadow stretched alongside hers. One afternoon, she found herself laughing softly at the sight of his gelding nudging the garden fence for carrots. The sound startled her. It had been years since laughter slipped from her unguarded. She quickly pressed a hand to her mouth, as if afraid it might betray her. Silas looked over from where he was tightening a rail. He didn't remark on it, only let the corner of his mouth curve in quiet acknowledgement, as if to say, "I heard it, and it's safe here." Evenings brought the hardest tests. The cabin's smallness left her no place to hide from memory. But Silas had a way of filling silence without words, whittling by the fire, humming low tunes as he checked his tack. Clementine would sit with her sewing or simply watch the flames, and little by little the silence between them shifted from suffocating to companionable. One night, when she dropped a spool of thread and bent to retrieve it, her hand brushed his as he reached at the same moment. She snatched hers back quickly, a blush warming her cheeks. "Sorry," she muttered. Silas shook his head, gentle as ever. Nothing to be sorry for. The words were simple, but they lingered in her chest. For so long, she had apologized for existing, for needing, for breaking. But in his presence, those apologies felt unnecessary. Still, trust didn't come easy. She lay awake many nights, whispering to herself that he'd leave soon, that she couldn't let hope take root. Yet each morning, Silas Boone was still there, carrying water, tending horses, repairing what was broken. Not once had he flinched at her sharpness or her silence. And slowly, against every defense she'd built, Clementine found herself waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch. Not because she needed saving, she told herself, but because his presence reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. For a woman who'd sworn off trust, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The summer night was still, the kind where crickets sang beneath a wide, star-flecked sky. Silas Boone sat by the fire outside, his hat tipped back as he whittled a scrap of wood into some shape known only to him. Clementine lingered on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees. She had been carrying the weight too long. Each day his quiet presence chipped away at the stone she'd built around herself, until the cracks yawned wide. Tonight, She could feel it, the ache of a truth pressing to be spoken. Her voice came out rough. Have you ever looked back at your life and wished you could scrape whole years clean, pretend they never happened? Silas's knife paused mid-stroke. He didn't look up, only asked softly, "What years weigh on you, Clementine?" Her throat tightened. "All of 'em since the day I said vows I should have never spoken. Thought I'd found a man to build a life with. Instead, I found fists. Found words that cut deeper than blades. He took every ounce of worth I had and ground it into the dirt." Her body trembled. But once the words started, they spilled like floodwater. "When he left, ran off with another woman. I thought I'd be glad. But the truth is, I stayed behind in ruins, convinced I was the reason, convinced no decent soul would ever look at me again without seeing the shame he branded on me. That's why I said it, Silas. I ain't worth savin'. I ain't worth nothin'." The fire popped, sparks lifting into the dark. For a long moment, silence stretched. Clementine braced for it, for the shift in his gaze, for the judgment or pity that always followed. But when Silas lifted his head, his eyes were steady, burning with something fierce and unyielding. He set the knife and wood aside, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "You're wrong." His voice was low, carrying a weight that wrapped around her. "Dead wrong." Her lips parted, stunned by the sharp certainty. "You think what that man did to you defines who you are?" He went on, his tone firm but never harsh. "He broke his vows, not you. He carried shame, not you. And if you believe his lies long enough to chain yourself with him, then he's still winning." Tears blurred her vision. "But I believed him, Silas. I let him make me believe it." He leaned closer, his words slow, deliberate, like nails driven into truth. "Then let me prove you wrong." The firelight danced in his eyes, unwavering. Not a plea, not a boast, just a vow forged in quiet strength. Clementine's breath caught. The world seemed to still, the cricket's song fading into the thunder of her heart. No one had ever looked at her like that. Not with pity, not with desire, but with conviction. She turned her face away, pressing her palms against her eyes as sobs threatened. But beneath the shame and fear, something else stirred a fragile seed of belief, trembling but alive. Silas Boone hadn't just heard her wound. He had claimed it as a battleground. And for the first time in years, Clementine wondered if healing was possible. The morning after her confession, Clementine felt raw, as though she'd stripped her soul bare and left it out in the night air. She half expected Silas to saddle up and ride off, the way most men did once they glimpsed too much of her truth. But when she stepped outside, she found him in the yard, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand as he worked on her leaning porch rail. He glanced up briefly, offering a nod as casual as if nothing had changed. The quiet normalcy rattled her more than pity ever could. "You're still here," she said softly, unable to mask the disbelief. Silas tapped a nail flush and straightened. "Told you I would be." The days that followed took on a rhythm unlike any Clementine had known in years. Together they worked side by side, mending fences, tending hens, patching the roof where rain had slipped through. Each task carried a small lesson, though he never spoke it outright. When she struggled to lift a beam, he didn't snatch it away, but placed his hand alongside hers, bearing the weight together. When she grew frustrated with her clumsy stitches on a grain sack, he only remarked, "Looks strong enough to hold," with a smile that eased her shame. One afternoon, Silas handed her the reins of his chestnut gelding. "He needs exercisin'. Thought you might like to take him out." Clementine froze. She hadn't been in a saddle since her husband had forbidden it, declaring she was too clumsy, too weak. Her stomach tightened with old echoes of his scorn. I can't," she whispered. "You can," Silas said gently, holding the reins steady, "and I'll walk beside you till you believe it." The fear almost swallowed her whole, but something in his steady gaze anchored her. With trembling hands, she mounted. The gelding shifted beneath her, solid and patient. Silas kept his word, leading her in slow circles around the yard, his presence as sure as the earth. With each lap, the tightness in her chest loosened, until she found herself exhaling a laugh of pure relief. "You did it," Silas said simply, pride warming his tone. Clementine pressed her hand to the horse's mane, her throat aching. "I did it." Words she hadn't dared speak about anything in years. That evening, as they shared bread by the fire, she caught herself watching Silas from the corner of her eye. He spoke little, yet his actions shouted louder than sermons. Every board he mended, every chore he shared, every moment he gave her space instead of judgment, they all wove together a truth she'd forgotten. She was worth standing beside. Still, doubt clung stubbornly. In the quiet of her room, Clementine whispered to herself, "It can't last. It never does." But in the morning, Silas Boone was still there, hammering, hauling, humming low, as if proving her wrong one sunrise at a time. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in small steps, like a wounded heart relearning how to beat in rhythm with another. And though Clementine fought to deny it, each step with Silas made her believe slowly, dangerously, that maybe she was worth saving after all. The rhythm of life had settled into something almost tender. Each day brought another small step of healing, another stone removed from the wall Clementine had built around her heart. But fragile things are easily shaken, and the world rarely lets peace linger long. It began with voices on the trail. Clementine was out by the corral, feeding the hens, when she saw two men ride up. She stiffened instantly. They were from town men, who had known her in the years when her husband ruled her life with cruelty. Their eyes flicked over her with that same old disdain, the kind that branded her worthless before she even spoke. "Well, if it ain't the widow Dyer," one sneered, leaning on his saddle horn. "Didn't think you'd still be scratching around out here alone." Clementine's hands tightened on the feed bucket. She wanted to turn, to vanish into the cabin, before her voice betrayed the tremble in her chest. But before she could move, Silas Boone stepped from the barn, his presence filling the yard like an oak tree against the wind. "She ain't alone," he said, calm but firm. The men exchanged glances, then smirked. "Didn't know you kept company with strays, Boone," the taller one drawled. "You're wasting your time. Women like her, she ain't worth the trouble." The words struck like a whip. Old shame rose hot in Clementine's throat, choking her. This was the truth she had told herself for years, now spoken aloud in front of the one man who had dared to treat her otherwise. She braced for Silas to falter, to waver under their mocking gaze. But his answer came steadily as bedrock. "Funny thing," he said, resting his hands lightly on his belt. "A man who talks that way usually ain't worth listening to." The riders bristled. One spat in the dirt. "Suit yourself, Boone. Don't say we didn't warn you." With that, they wheeled their horses and trotted back down the trail, their laughter fading on the wind. The yard fell quiet again. Clementine's chest heaved, her fingers clenching white around the bucket's handle. She turned sharply toward the cabin, desperate to escape before Silas could see the tears pressing at her eyes. But his voice followed, low and steady. "Don't you listen to 'em, Clementine." She froze on the porch steps, her back to him. "They just said what I've been knowing all along," she whispered. "You'll see it too one day, and you'll ride off the same as the rest." Silas stepped closer, his boots crunching the gravel. "No, ma'am. I saw the truth the first day I stopped here, and I've been seeing it every day since. You're stronger than you know, and you're worth every bit of the trouble." Her breath hitched, tears sliding unchecked down her cheeks. She wanted to argue, to shove the words away before they sank too deep. But the steel in his tone left no room for doubt. For once, Clementine let herself stand still, let herself feel the weight of a man who chose her, even when the world said she wasn't worth choosing. And in that stillness, something long buried stirred into life. The prairie was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. No longer heavy, no longer suffocating. It was the hush of peace settling after a storm. Clementine stood by the corral fence, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. Silas Boone was saddling his horse, the late sun catching in his hair, burnishing him in gold. For a breath, panic gripped her chest. Maybe this was it. Maybe he would ride on, after all. She stepped forward quickly, her voice breaking. "Silas." He turned, calm as ever. "Yeah?" Her throat worked, the words trembling on her tongue. She had lived so long inside silence that speaking now felt like leaping into a canyon. But she did it anyway. "I believed I wasn't worth savin'," she whispered. "I believed it for so long, I nearly carved it into my bones. But you proved me wrong. And I can't let you leave without sayin', I don't want to be alone anymore." The weight of years lifted with every syllable. Her chest felt light, her tears unashamed. Silas crossed the distance in a few steps. His rough hand brushed her cheek, gentle as a prayer. "Clementine," he said softly, "I told you once, I don't scare easily, and I ain't riding off. Not now, not ever." The words settled deep, not as promise, but as vow. She leaned into his touch, the last of her walls falling away. For the first time in years, Clementine believed in something bigger than sorrow. She believed in him, and, slowly, she believed in herself. The sun dipped low, painting them both in light, and in that moment, a broken woman found redemption in love. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.